The penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline was suffocatingly quiet, a picture of modern perfection. Ivy adjusted her fiancé's tie with a practiced, loving smile, but her pulse raced as her phone vibrated in her pocket, a message from the past she thought she had buried. It is terrifying how easily a meticulously constructed new life can shatter over a single unspoken betrayal. If these fragile, dangerous emotional cuts resonate with you, stay with me. There are many more secrets behind these closed doors. Don't leave just yet. The rain sliding down the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Michelin-starred restaurant distorted the glittering Chicago skyline into a blur of restless gold and silver. Inside, the atmosphere was a masterclass in curated perfection. The soft clinking of crystal, the low murmur of affluent perrins, and the subtle scent of expensive truffles masked the quiet desperation that always seemed to hum beneath the surface of the city's elite. Ivy. Elizabeth sat across from her fiancé, swirling the deep red Barolo in her glass. She offered him a practiced, flawless smile. "To the future senior partner," Brandon Gray said, raising his glass to meet hers. His eyes, sharp and perpetually hungry, held the confident gleam of a man who believed the world was engineered specifically for his success. "To you," Ivy replied softly. The crystal rang with a delicate, hollow sound. Brandon was on the verge of the biggest promotion of his life at Parker Consulting. It was the culmination of 3 years of relentless ambition, the exact amount of time since Ivy had walked out of a sterile, blindingly white hospital room, leaving behind a marriage, a shattered man, and her own conscience. She had chosen Brandon. She had chosen the thrill, the vitality, the unapologetic drive, effectively leaving her husband to drown in the wreckage of a tragic accident and an even more tragic betrayal. She took a sip of the wine. It tasted heavy like iron and dark fruit catching slightly in her throat. "They're announcing the new CEO on Monday." Brandon continued, slicing into his steak with precise, aggressive motions. "The board bought out the old regime. Word is the new guy is a ghost. No social media, no public profiles, just a trail of ruthless acquisitions out of New York. A corporate apex predator." "Does that worry you?" Ivy asked, her fingers tracing the condensation on the stem of her glass. "Worry me," Brandon scoffed softly, a smirk playing on his lips. "I thrive under pressure, Ivy. Whoever he is, he'll need an inside man to navigate the Chicago accounts. I just need to make sure I'm the first hand he shakes." Ivy nodded, but a sudden, inexplicable chill prickled the back of her neck. She glanced away, looking at the rain-streaked window. For a fraction of a second, the reflection in the glass didn't show Brandon's handsome, arrogant face. Her mind conjured the memory of monitors beeping in a rhythmic, agonizing cadence, the smell of antiseptic, a pale hand lying motionless on a white sheet. "Stop it," she ordered herself, blinking rapidly to clear the phantom image. "That life is dead. He is gone." Her phone vibrated in her designer clutch. It was a brief distraction, but welcome. She slipped it out under the table, shielding the screen from Brandon's view. It was a text from an unknown number. "Parker Consulting Gala, Monday 8 p.m. Be there, Ivy. Mike J." Her breath hitched, stalling in her lungs. Mike Johnson. The name was a ghost from a past she had buried under layers of expensive clothes and forced smiles. Mike had been his best friend, his loyal shadow. Why would Mike be messaging her about a corporate gala at Brandon's firm? "Everything all right, darling?" Brandon asked, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin, his gaze analytical. Ivy quickly locked the screen, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She forced the practiced smile back onto her face, though the edges trembled slightly. "Just a spam message," she lied smoothly, slipping the phone back into the dark confines of her bag. "Nothing important." But as she looked back at Brandon, the expensive wine suddenly turned sour in her stomach. The perfect curated illusion of her new life felt incredibly fragile, as if a single unspoken truth was about to shatter the glass walls she had built around herself. The ghost she had left for dead wasn't just haunting her memory anymore. It felt as though he was breathing the very same air. The soaring glass atrium of the Adler Planetarium, rented out exclusively for the Parker Consulting Gala, offered a dizzying, unobstructed view of the Chicago skyline against the black, restless waters of Lake Michigan. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive cologne white lilies and the electric hum of corporate anticipation. Ivy stood near a towering floral arrangement, her fingers tightly coiled around the slender stem of a champagne flute. The glass was slick with condensation, her palms unusually cold. A few feet away, Brandon was in his element, laughing with a group of senior partners. He navigated the room with the effortless grace of a shark swimming through familiar currents. Ivy, however, felt as though she were drowning in inches of water. The cryptic text message from Mike Johnson had gnawed at her sanity all weekend. She had spent the last 3 days glancing over her shoulder, jumping at the sound of her own ringtone. Why would Mike be here? The question echoed relentlessly in her mind. The ambient jazz music faded as a microphone on the central stage let out a brief, sharp whine of feedback. The outgoing chairman stepped up to the podium, his voice booming through the cavernous space. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight marks the dawn of a new era for Parker Consulting. Ivy's chest tightened. She found herself staring at the dark shadows just off stage, a sudden heavy pressure settling at the base of her skull. Please welcome our new Chief Executive Officer. A figure emerged from the periphery. He did not stride into the light with the desperate, eager energy of a corporate climber. His movements were measured, deliberate, and slightly uneven. A sleek black cane with a silver handle tapped softly against the polished marble floor, a rhythmic, haunting sound that seemed to slice through the polite applause of the crowd. Ivy's breath evaporated entirely from her lungs. The man stepping into the harsh white spotlight wore a charcoal bespoke suit that draped flawlessly over a frame much leaner and sharper than she remembered. His face, once open and quick to smile, was now carved from ice. Subtle pale scars trailed along his jawline and disappeared beneath his collar, the permanent, unavoidable receipts of a shattered windshield, a crushed steering column, and a wife who had walked away. It was Lucas Scott, the husband she had abandoned in a hospital bed, taking her settlement and her secret lover to build this exact fragile life. Thank you, Lucas said into the microphone. His voice was lower now, carrying a slight rough rasp that stripped away any trace of his former warmth. Parker Consulting has always prided itself on vision, but vision without ruthless execution is just a hallucination. Beside her, Brandon leaned close, his eyes wide with hungry admiration. Look at him, Ivy. The guy is a machine. This is exactly the kind of bloodletting the firm needs. Ivy could not respond. Her throat was entirely paralyzed. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Lucas continued his brief, razor-sharp address outlining a future of restructuring and high-stakes accountability. And then, as if guided by an invisible magnetic current, his gaze swept over the sea of faces and stopped. He found her. Across 50 feet of mingling executives, his dark eyes locked onto Ivy's. The world around her, the clinking glasses, Brandon's eager whispers, the sprawling city lights faded into a suffocating, terrifying vacuum. She expected rage. She braced herself for the raw, burning hatred of a man left to die alone in the dark. Instead, she saw nothing. An absolute freezing void. It was the look of a man staring at a piece of broken furniture he had already decided to throw away. A fraction of a second later, his gaze shifted effortlessly to Brandon, lingering just long enough to register the man's identity before moving on entirely unbothered. I look forward to seeing what you are all truly made of. Lucas finished, stepping back from the podium. The applause was thunderous. The champagne flute in Ivy's trembling hand finally slipped. It shattered against the marble floor, a sharp, violent noise drowned out by the clapping crowd, but to Ivy it sounded exactly like the end of her life. Monday morning arrived with the dull gray light typical of a Chicago autumn. Inside the master bedroom of their sprawling Gold Coast apartment, the air felt dangerously thin. Brandon stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, aggressively adjusting the knot of a navy silk tie. He was practically vibrating with adrenaline, entirely oblivious to the rigid statue-like posture of the woman sitting on the edge of the unmade bed. Direct oversight, Brandon said, reading the email on his phone for the fourth time since his alarm rang. His thumb scrolled over the screen with frantic excitement. Scott is personally restructuring the top-tier accounts, and he's pulling me in to assist the transition. Do you know what this means, Ivy? He's bypassing the senior partners. I'm skipping the middleman entirely. Ivy stared at her own hands folded so tightly in her lap that the skin over her knuckles was bone white. That is a big step, Brandon. Her voice sounded hollow, stripped of any real inflection, but Brandon was too consumed by his own reflection and the intoxicating scent of power to notice. He tossed the phone into his leather briefcase, snapped the brass clasp shut, and walked over to her. He pressed a hurried, absent-minded kiss to the top of her head. "I'll be late tonight," he promised, his tone brimming with ambition. "Have to make sure the new king knows exactly who his best soldier is." The heavy click of the front door deadbolt echoing through the hallway sounded exactly like a prison cell locking shut. When Ivy was finally alone, the curated silence of the apartment descended upon her like a physical, crushing weight. She remained perfectly still on the edge of the mattress for several long minutes, listening to the distant, muffled sounds of traffic 50 stories below. Slowly, she walked to the kitchen to pour a glass of water, but her legs felt entirely leaden. Lucas's face, the cold, empty void in his dark eyes at the gala, flashed violently behind her eyelids. He wasn't just back in Chicago. He had orchestrated this entire scenario. Out of hundreds of executives, he had plucked Brandon out, placing the younger man directly beneath his thumb. It was not a fast track to a promotion. It was a meticulously crafted snare. Ivy leaned heavily against the cold marble of the kitchen island. The apartment, with its imported designer furniture and sweeping city views, suddenly felt like a suffocating glass cage. Lucas held all the keys. He could crush Brandon's career with a single signature on a termination form. He could expose her past with a single casual sentence at a board meeting. But the truest horror was that Lucas didn't have to do any of that. He didn't even have to look at her to destroy her all over again. He was going to do it by slowly, quietly dismantling the man she had traded him for. A sharp, burning sensation bloomed deep behind her ribs. The pain spread upward, wrapping tight around her throat like a physical hand. Ivy gasped, opening her mouth, but the air in the room simply refused to enter her lungs. The meticulous, expensive kitchen began to spin, the edges of her vision blurring into a frantic gray. She gripped the edge of the counter, her neatly manicured nails digging into the stone as a wave of absolute primal terror washed over her. Her heart hammered a chaotic, violent rhythm against her sternum. Unable to support her own weight, Ivy slid down the smooth wooden cabinet doors. Her knees hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud. She pulled her legs to her chest, burying her face in her arms, and began to tremble violently in the empty, silent room. The ghosts she had ruthlessly buried 3 years ago were not just awake. They were breathing the same air, pulling the strings, and slowly suffocating her in her own home. The digital clock on the bedside table flipped from 1:59 to 2 a.m., its soft blue light casting long, hollow shadows across the pristine, empty half of the mattress. Outside the panoramic windows, the Chicago wind howled over Lake Michigan, rattling the heavy glass panes of the luxury apartment with a low, mournful vibration. Ivy sat motionless in the darkened living room, a silk robe pulled tight across her chest, staring blindly at her phone. The screen briefly illuminated her pale, exhausted face before dimming back to black. Text from Brandon, 9:30 p.m. "Still here. Scott wants the quarterly projections rerun from scratch. Won't be long." Text from Brandon, 11:45 p.m. "He found a formatting error. Have to redo the entire deck. Don't wait up." She had not replied to either. She couldn't find the words. On the dining table, a meticulously prepared dinner of roasted sea bass and asparagus had long since gone cold. The white porcelain plates sat under the dim pendant lights, looking less like a meal and more like small, quiet tombstones mourning the evening. This was the 4th consecutive night. Ever since the restructuring began, Lucas had anchored Brandon to his desk, feeding him an endless, agonizing drip of reports, revisions, and impossible deadlines. Lucas never yelled. He never threatened. He simply sent sterile, polite emails demanding absolute perfection, by dawn forcing Brandon to sacrifice his sleep, his sanity, and his fiancée to prove his corporate worth. Ivy pulled her knees to her chest on the velvet sofa, shivering despite the climate-controlled air. The silence of the apartment was no longer just heavy, it was loud. It roared with the ghosts of her own making. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she wasn't in a penthouse overlooking the Gold Coast. She was standing in the hallway of her old suburban home 3.5 years ago. She remembered the faint glow of the television in the living room where Lucas used to fall asleep waiting for her. She remembered slipping off her heels to muffle her footsteps, the lingering scent of Brandon's cologne on her skin, and the practiced lies she would rehearse in the dark before sliding into bed beside her husband. She had thought herself so clever back then, so invincible in her deceit. Now the universe was forcing her to drink the exact poison she had poured for him. She was the one waiting in the dark. She was the one staring at a cold dinner, listening to the agonizing tick of a clock, wondering where the man she loved was and what was truly keeping him away. At 3:15 a.m., her phone buzzed violently against the glass coffee table. The sudden noise made her flinch, her heart leaping into her throat. She snatched it up. It wasn't a text from Brandon. It was an email notification. A forwarded message automatically routed to her personal address from an old joint account she had forgotten to close during the divorce. Sender L.Scott@parkerconsulting.com, recipient B.gray@parkerconsulting.com. Subject REQ3 restructuring deck message. The analysis is sloppy, Brandon. Attention to detail is everything in this firm. When you take something that doesn't belong to you, you must be prepared to maintain it flawlessly. Start over. Have it on my desk by 7 a.m. Ivy stared at the glowing text, her breathing turning shallow and ragged in the quiet room. When you take something that doesn't belong to you, it wasn't about the quarterly deck. Brandon would read it as a harsh corporate reprimand, but Ivy knew the truth. The wording was deliberate, a surgical strike aimed directly at her chest. It was a message meant for her eyes, proving that Lucas knew exactly where she was, exactly what she was feeling, and that he was the one pulling the strings from the shadows. Her hand trembled so violently she could barely hold the device. She dropped the phone onto the carpet. The screen went black, leaving her entirely alone in the suffocating dark, trapped in a cage built from her own sins. The private dining room at the Wellington Club was a masterclass in intimidation. Dark mahogany paneled the walls, absorbing the dim light from a single antique chandelier. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, sealing the room off from the rest of the world. Ivy sat rigidly on a leather chair, the silk of her emerald dress suddenly feeling like a corset laced far too tight. Directly across the circular table sat Lucas. He was nursing a glass of Macallan, the amber liquid catching the low light. He looked entirely at ease, the picture of absolute untouchable authority. To his right, Brandon was practically leaning out of his seat, eagerly detailing his strategy for the upcoming telecom merger. The cost synergies alone justify the aggressive timeline, Brandon said, gesturing with a silver fork. I can have my team draft the initial transition framework by Monday. Lucas did not look at Brandon. His dark, unfathomable eyes were fixed entirely on Ivy. Ambition is an excellent trait, Brandon. Lucas murmured, his voice a low, smooth baritone that sent a violent shiver down Ivy's spine. But in my experience, a man's endurance in this industry is entirely dependent on his foundation. The woman behind him. The anchor. He took a slow sip of his scotch. Tell me, Ivy, do you consider yourself a good anchor? Ivy's throat seized. She forced her frozen lips to part. I do my best to support him. I'm sure you do, Lucas replied softly. He set his glass down. The soft clink against the crystal coaster sounded like a gavel dropping. It requires a rare kind of loyalty, the kind of devotion that keeps a person sitting in the dark waiting through the hardest hours, the kind of woman who wouldn't just walk away when things get broken. Brandon chuckled, entirely oblivious to the lethal current running beneath the words. She's the best, Lucas. Honestly, with the hours I've been pulling in this week, I don't know how she hasn't packed her bags. Yes, Lucas agreed, his gaze slowly dragging over Ivy's pale face, tracing the barely concealed terror in her eyes. It is fascinating what some women are willing to pack their bags for, and what they are willing to leave behind. Ivy reached for her water goblet, her hand trembling so severely she had to use both hands to lift it. The water tasted like ash. Every word Lucas spoke was a surgical blade cutting open the exact memory of the day she had packed her suitcases while he lay comatose in the ICU. A waiter materialized silently from the shadows, pouring a rich dark red wine into their glasses. I took the liberty of ordering the wine for the table, Lucas said, watching the crimson liquid swirl. Chateau Margaux, 2015. I read somewhere that people rarely change their inherent tastes even when they drastically change their environments. Ivy's lungs physically stopped working. Chateau Margaux 2015 was the wine they had opened on their third wedding anniversary. Excellent choice, Brandon praised, taking a generous sip. It's fantastic. Isn't it Lucas asked, his eyes never leaving Ivy. The cold, dead void in his stare had been replaced by something far more dangerous, a quiet, burning satisfaction. Go on, Ivy. Drink. It would be a shame to let something so expensive go to waste. Again. She lifted the glass. The scent of dark fruit and oak hit her instantly, resurrecting the ghost of a smiling husband, a warm suburban kitchen, and a life she had murdered. She took a sip, swallowing the wine like broken glass. The rest of the dinner stretched into an agonizing eternity. Lucas played the gracious host, trapping Brandon in a web of professional flattery, while he slowly, methodically suffocated Ivy with memories she could neither acknowledge nor escape. When the bill finally arrived, Ivy felt as though she had been bled completely dry, sitting opposite the ghost who now held the knife. The click of the deadbolt at 4:30 a.m. wasn't a familiar comfort. It sounded like a gunshot in the silent apartment. Ivy stood up from the velvet sofa, pulling her silk robe tighter around her waist. Brandon walked through the door, looking nothing like the polished, predatory executive who had charmed her away from her suburban life 3 years ago. His tie was yanked loose, his expensive shirt wrinkled, and dark bruised shadows hung beneath his eyes. He threw his heavy leather briefcase onto the glass console table with enough force to make the pane rattle violently. Brandon, Ivy asked, her voice cautious as she stepped out of the shadows of the living room. He didn't look at her. He bypassed her entirely, heading straight for the bar cart. His hands shook with a suppressed, erratic energy as he poured a reckless measure of gin into a crystal tumbler. He drank it neat, his face twisting as the alcohol hit his empty stomach. He rejected the transition framework. Brandon muttered, his voice raw, staring at the empty glass. Threw the folder on the floor. He actually dropped it on the floor and told me to pick it up and try again. The man is a complete sociopath, Ivy. Ivy crossed the room slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the imported hardwood. She reached out gently, placing a hand on his tense shoulder. You're exhausted. Come to bed. You can look at it with fresh eyes in a few hours. Brandon flinched. He jerked his shoulder away from her touch as if her skin were made of burning iron. Fresh eyes, are you even listening to me? He turned to face her, his eyes wild and bloodshot. I don't have a few hours. He wants the revised draft by a 9 a.m. board meeting. He is actively trying to humiliate me in front of the entire executive committee. Then let him, Ivy said softly, the words slipping out in a desperate breath. Just step back, Brandon. Ask to be reassigned to a different account. It isn't worth this. Brandon stared at her, his expression slowly twisting into a mask of pure, condescending disgust. It was a look she had never seen directed at her before, a look completely devoid of love. Step back. Are you out of your mind? He snapped, his voice echoing sharply off the high ceilings. This is Parker Consulting, Ivy, not a charity. If I step back, I'm dead in the water. My career is over. He stepped closer, invading her space. The smell of gin and stale, sour adrenaline radiated off his skin. You really don't get it, do you? You sit up here in this penthouse all day, playing house with my money while I am down there getting butchered. The words struck her like a physical blow. The air rushed out of her lungs, leaving her entirely hollow. That isn't fair, she whispered, her hands dropping to her sides. Fair. Brandon let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded like scraping metal. Nothing is fair. I'm fighting for my life down there, and I come home to what? You looking at me like I'm a wounded animal. I don't need your pity, Ivy. I just need you to stay out of my way. He pushed past her, heading down the hallway toward the guest bedroom. A second later, he slammed the door so hard the framed photographs on the wall vibrated against the plaster. Ivy stood entirely alone in the center of the dark living room, the sting of his words burning like acid through her veins. The charismatic, invincible lover who had promised her the world had vanished, leaving behind a cruel, fragile man who fractured at the very first sign of real pressure. She looked down at her trembling hands. When Lucas's world had shattered, when his spine was fractured, and his career suspended in the agonizing wake of the car crash, he had never raised his voice at her. Even through the blinding haze of physical agony, he had only ever apologized for being a burden. The realization was a slow, suffocating poison. Lucas wasn't just destroying Brandon's career. He was holding up a merciless mirror, forcing Ivy to see the exact worthless nature of the prize she had sacrificed everything to win. The overcast Chicago sky cast a heavy slate gray pall over the city. Inside the upscale, dimly lit coffee shop, a few blocks from Parker Consulting, the hiss of the espresso machine and the low hum of jazz provided a fragile barrier against the biting autumn chill. Ivy sat in a secluded corner booth, her untouched latte cooling rapidly in its ceramic mug. She had fled the apartment simply to escape the suffocating silence and the lingering scent of Brandon's gin-soaked rage. She kept her gaze fixed on the rain-slicked pavement outside, trying to empty her own mind entirely. "Do you know why he uses the cane, Ivy?" The voice was quiet, steady, and entirely unexpected. Ivy flinched, turning sharply. Mike Johnson stood at the edge of her booth. He wore a tailored charcoal coat, holding a simple black coffee. He didn't wait for an invitation before sliding into the leather seat directly across from her. 3 years had aged him. The easygoing, laughing best friend she remembered from neighborhood barbecues was gone, replaced by a man with cold, calculating eyes. "Mike," Ivy breathed, her voice trembling. Her instinct was to stand up and run, but her body remained entirely paralyzed. "It's not for show," Mike continued smoothly, ignoring her distress. He took a slow sip of his coffee. The steering column shattered his right femur and crushed 3 vertebrae. The doctors wanted to amputate the leg. They said he would never walk unassisted again. Ivy squeezed her eyes shut. "Please, stop." "Stop." Mike tilted his head, his expression devoid of any sympathy. "You stopped, Ivy. You stopped visiting after week 2. I remember. I was the one sitting in the hard plastic chair in the ICU when the nurses had to pin him down because the nerve pain was so severe it caused violent seizures." Ivy opened her eyes. The walls of the coffee shop felt as though they were closing in. Her chest heaved with shallow, inadequate breaths. "I couldn't." She choked out, a single pathetic tear escaping and tracing a hot path down her pale cheek. "I couldn't watch him die." "He didn't die," Mike stated flatly, leaning forward. The ambient noise of the cafe seemed to vanish, leaving only the sharp, merciless cadence of his words. "He lived. And he woke up every single day in blinding agony, reaching for a wife who was busy picking out custom Italian leather sofas for her new lover's penthouse." Mike set his coffee cup down on the wooden table. The dull thud resonated in Ivy's hollow chest. 4 reconstructive surgeries. Mike listed, ticking them off with a chilling detachment. 9 months of excruciating physical therapy just to be able to stand upright. He spent his first Christmas after the accident learning how to hold a fork again while his lawyers were reading your settlement demands. Ivy covered her mouth with trembling hands, a wave of profound physical nausea washing over her. The polished, terrifying CEO she had seen at the gala, the man methodically destroying Brandon's life, was suddenly replaced in her mind's eye by a broken, bleeding man crying out in an empty, sterile hospital room. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered through her fingers, completely broken. Mike looked at her, his eyes reflecting absolute freezing contempt. "Because Brandon thinks Lucas is just a ruthless businessman testing him," Mike said quietly, rising from the booth. "But you need to know the truth. You need to know exactly what kind of monster you built out of the man who loved you. And you need to know that he is never, ever going to stop." Mike adjusted his coat and walked out into the cold Chicago rain, leaving Ivy entirely alone with a cup of cold coffee and a paralyzing, monstrous guilt that no amount of money or time could ever wash away. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the Chicago streets slick and reflective under the amber glow of the streetlights. Inside the penthouse, the silence was no longer merely heavy, it was terminal. It was Friday evening when the front door opened. Ivy didn't need to look up from the leather armchair to know something catastrophic had happened. There was no aggressive slamming of briefcases, no sharp, angry footsteps echoing down the hall. There was only a slow, dragging shuffle. When Brandon finally appeared in the living room archway, Ivy barely recognized him. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy of Parker Consulting was entirely gone. His tie was missing. The top 3 buttons of his shirt were torn open and his face was a sickly ashen gray. He looked physically ill, trembling so violently he had to lean against the doorframe to remain upright. "Brandon," Ivy stood up, her voice cautious. The lingering horror of her conversation with Mike Johnson still coated her throat like ash. But the sight of Brandon's complete collapse forced her to move forward. "I'm dead," Brandon whispered. The words were hollow, scraped from the bottom of his lungs. He slid down the wall, his knees giving out, until he was sitting on the hardwood floor, staring at nothing. "He killed me, Ivy." "What happened?" She knelt a few feet away from him, keeping a safe distance. The telecom merger, Brandon choked out, running a trembling hand through his ruined hair. He ordered a forensic audit on the transition framework. He found a discrepancy, a massive compliance violation from a vendor I approved 2 years ago. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know. But my signature is on the approval forms. Ivy's blood ran cold. Lucas hadn't just given Brandon impossible tasks to tire him out. He had been systematically digging through 3 years of corporate history, hunting for the exact bullet he needed. He's calling a disciplinary board on Monday. Brandon continued, his voice cracking, tears of pure panic pooling in his bloodshot eyes. He isn't just going to fire me. He is going to hand the audit over to the SEC. I'll be blacklisted. I'll face federal charges. He's taking everything. Ivy stared at the man cowering on her floor. This was the man for whom she had destroyed her marriage. This trembling, weeping shell was the prize she had chosen over a husband who had endured bone-crushing agony in utter silence. A sickening wave of disgust aimed entirely at herself washed over her. Then hire a lawyer, Ivy said softly, her tone stripped of any warmth. Fight it. You don't fight Lucas Scott. Brandon suddenly screamed, a pathetic, desperate sound that echoed off the glass walls. He is untouchable. He holds all the cards. Brandon scrambled forward on his knees, reaching out to grab Ivy's hands. His palms were clammy, slick with cold sweat. She tried to pull away, but his grip was desperate. There's only one way out, Brandon pleaded, his voice dropping to a pathetic, ragged whisper. When he handed me the notice, he said something. He said, it's a shame your anchor couldn't keep you from drifting into the rocks. And then he looked at me, Ivy. He looked right through me and said, maybe she should be the one explaining this to me. Ivy's heart stopped. The penthouse around her seemed to tilt violently. He wants me to come to him. The realization was absolute. The impossible tasks, the silent dinner, the horrific revelations from Mike, it had all been a meticulously constructed funnel designed to herd her toward exactly one door. Lucas had broken Brandon in not just for revenge, but to force Ivy to walk back into his domain entirely stripped of her power and her pride. Ivy, please, Brandon sobbed, burying his face against her hands. You're beautiful. You're persuasive. Just go to his office. Talk to him. Beg him. Do whatever it takes, please. You have to save me. She looked down at the man sobbing on his knees, begging his fiancé to offer herself up to another man to save his own skin. The illusion of her perfect life didn't just shatter. It dissolved into dust. Okay, Ivy whispered, her voice devoid of life. I will go to him. The elevator chimed a soft synthetic note that sounded entirely too loud on the deserted 72nd floor of Parker Consulting. It was a few minutes past 9 on a Friday night. The sprawling expanse of cubicles and frosted glass conference rooms was submerged in heavy shadows, illuminated only by the emergency track lighting and the cold, distant glow of the city through the windows. Ivy stepped out. Her black stiletto heels sank into the plush carpet, muffling her footsteps as she walked down the long corridor toward the CEO's suite. Every breath she took felt thick, tasting of sterile recycled air and copper panic. The heavy oak door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. A single strip of warm amber light spilled out onto the dark carpet. She paused, her hand hovering over the brass handle. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished wood, pale, immaculate, and utterly hollow. She pushed the door open. The corner office was vast, an imposing sanctuary of dark leather, glass, and shadow. Lucas stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling grid of Chicago traffic. He had removed his suit jacket. His shoulders were tense under the crisp white fabric of his dress shirt, and his right hand rested heavily on the silver handle of his cane. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. I wondered how long it would take him to send you, Lucas said. His voice was quiet, completely devoid of the sharp corporate edge he had wielded at the dinner. It was a terrifying, intimate sound. Ivy closed the door behind her. The click of the latch sealed them in. He didn't send me. I came on my own. Please, Ivy, Lucas murmured, finally turning away from the glass. The city lights cast harsh architectural shadows across the pale scars on his jaw. We spent 5 years together. You don't have to lie to me anymore. You have nothing left to hide, and I have nothing left to believe. He moved toward his desk, his gait slow and deliberate, the cane marking his progress with a soft, rhythmic thud against the hardwood floor. He sank into the leather chair, intertwining his fingers, and simply looked at her. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no hatred. There was an absolute freezing emptiness that was infinitely worse. He didn't know about the vendor compliance. Ivy started, her voice trembling, despite her desperate attempts to hold it steady. You know he didn't. You dug back 3 years just to find a technicality. You're going to ruin him. I am merely holding my executives accountable, Lucas replied smoothly. If Brandon cannot manage his paperwork, he cannot manage my firm. This isn't about the firm. Ivy's voice cracked a sudden, sharp sound in the quiet room. She took a step forward, her hands clenching at her sides. This is about us. This is about what I did to you. Punish me, Lucas. Do whatever you want to me, but let him go. He is falling apart. Silence descended upon the office, heavy and absolute. Lucas stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. He tilted his head, slightly studying her as if she were a fascinating, tragic exhibit in a museum. Have you actually considered the geometry of this moment, Ivy? He asked softly. You are standing in my office in the dark, begging your former husband to save the career of the man you abandoned me for. The words struck her like a physical blow to the stomach. All the air rushed out of her lungs. You think this is about punishment? Lucas continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. He leaned forward in the faint light, catching the cold ruin in his eyes. Punishing you would imply I still care what happens to you. I don't want to punish you, Ivy. I want you to look at the man you destroyed me to build. I want you to see that he is a coward who will push the woman he supposedly loves into the line of fire just to save his own skin. Ivy stood entirely paralyzed. The horrific truth of his words bypassed her defenses and settled deep into her bones. I am not going to save him. Lucas stated, his tone final and absolute. He picked up a silver pen, returning his attention to a file on his desk, dismissing her entirely. And the tragedy is neither are you. You can find your own way out. Ivy remained frozen for a second longer, the ashes of her pride and her perfect life settling around her on the dark floor before she turned and fled into the blinding silence of the hallway. The executive boardroom on the 70th floor of Parker Consulting was an expansive, sterile cage of frosted glass, polished chrome, and white leather. The relentless hum of the central air conditioning was the only sound masking the terrifying, steady ticking of the wall clock. Monday morning had arrived with the swift, merciless drop of a guillotine. Ivy sat rigidly on a low bench against the back wall. Brandon had insisted she come, claiming that presenting a united stable front would soften the board's perception. Now, looking at the scene unfolding around the massive mahogany table, she realized she was not there as a pillar of support. She had been brought as a shield. At the head of the table sat Lucas. He wore a dark, immaculate suit, his hands resting lightly over the silver handle of his cane. Flanking him were 3 senior compliance officers and an external legal counsel, their faces carved from stone. In the center, under the harsh glare of the recessed lighting, Brandon looked like a man standing on a trap door. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling, as he flipped through the damning audit report. The digital signature on the vendor approval was executed from a home IP address. The lead investigator stated, her voice devoid of emotion. It bypassed the standard compliance protocol. This is not just a procedural error, Mr. Gray. It is corporate fraud. Brandon swallowed hard. His eyes darted frantically around the room, skipping over Lucas's cold, impassive stare and landing on the blinking red light of the audio recorder in the center of the table. I didn't authorize it, Brandon stammered, his voice climbing an octave. I was in New York during that entire week. The IP address confirms it was done from my Chicago residence. I wasn't there. Then who executed the signature? The investigator asked. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ivy watched Brandon's shoulders cave inward. He looked down at his shaking hands, and then, with the slow, agonizing movement of a drowning man reaching for a raft, he turned his head and looked directly at her. My fiancée, Brandon said. The words hung in the chilled air, fragile and toxic. Ivy stopped breathing. The room seemed to tilt violently on its axis. Ivy had full access to my secure login. Brandon continued, his voice picking up a frantic, desperate momentum. He was entirely ignoring the horrified, deadened look in her eyes. She managed my administrative overflow. She organized my inbox. She must have clicked the approval link by mistake, or she didn't understand the documents. I am completely innocent. He was throwing her under the bus. To save himself from an SEC investigation and corporate exile, the man she loved was actively offering her up to face federal fraud charges. He was framing her for a crime she didn't even know how to commit. The compliance officers murmured, taking notes. But Ivy didn't look at them. She didn't look at the trembling, pathetic shell of the man she had planned to marry. She looked at Lucas. Lucas sat perfectly still at the head of the table. His dark eyes were fixed on Ivy, locking onto hers across the expanse of the boardroom. There was no triumph in his gaze, no cruel smirk. There was only a quiet, devastating confirmation. "Look at him," his silence screamed. "Look at the exact worth of what you chose." A cold, numbing clarity washed over Ivy, extinguishing the last remaining spark of her sanity. She had shattered a good man's life, abandoned him in his most excruciating hour of need, and burned her own soul to ashes, all to build a kingdom with a man who would gladly feed her to the wolves the moment the crown slipped. "Mrs. Elizabeth," the legal counsel asked, turning toward the back wall, "do you corroborate Mr. Gray's statement?" Ivy stood up. Her legs felt weightless. She looked at Brandon, seeing the desperate, begging cowardice bleeding from his pores, and then she looked back to the man she had left for dead. The cycle of betrayal was complete, and she was standing entirely alone in the ruins. "No," and Ivy's voice was not loud, but it cut through the heavy, sterile air of the boardroom like a shard of glass. She did not look at the compliance officers or the legal counsel. She kept her eyes fixed on Brandon. The man she had rearranged her entire existence for was shrinking before her, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a borrowed costume on a terrified child. "I have never had access to his secure login," Ivy continued, her tone eerily hollow, entirely drained of panic or tears. "I do not know the passwords. I do not manage his administrative overflow. He is lying." "She's scared?" Brandon stammered, his voice cracking violently as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. "She's panicking and trying to cover her tracks. You have the IP address." "I do have the IP address," Lucas interrupted. His voice was a low, smooth baritone that instantly paralyzed the room. The frantic scratching of the compliance officer's pen ceased. Brandon's jaw snapped shut. Lucas slowly opened the leather-bound folder resting on the table before him. He did not look at Brandon. He extracted a single sheet of paper and slid it across the polished wood. "The signature was executed from a residential IP," Lucas stated, his dark eyes finally lifting to meet Brandon's terrified gaze. "But IT forensics also pulled the MAC address of the device used. It belongs to your personal company-issued laptop, Brandon. Furthermore, the keystroke logs confirmed the session was active for 45 minutes prior to the signature drafting emails from your private account. You were not in New York. You were sitting in your apartment, signing off on a fraudulent vendor." The silence that rushed into the room was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of an execution. Lucas had known the truth the entire time. He had possessed the irrefutable proof before the meeting even began. He hadn't called this tribunal to find the culprit. He had orchestrated this exact scenario to watch Brandon fracture under pressure. He had built a trap solely to prove to Ivy that the man she loved would sacrifice her without a second thought. Brandon's face lost whatever color it had left. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, breathless wheeze escaped. "You are terminated, effective immediately," Lucas said softly. He closed the leather folder. The quiet thud sounded like a coffin lid dropping. "Your severance is forfeit. Our legal department will forward the audit to the SEC by noon. Security is waiting in the hall to escort you out." Brandon stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He looked around the room, a cornered animal, realizing there were no doors left. Finally, his eyes landed on Ivy. He reached out a trembling hand toward her. "Ivy, please." Ivy looked at his outstretched hand. She felt no anger, no sorrow, not even pity. She felt entirely, completely empty. She looked down at her own left hand. The 3-carat diamond engagement ring felt suddenly like lead, a heavy, meaningless shackle anchoring her to a ghost. Slowly, she slid the ring off her finger. She walked forward and placed it on the edge of the boardroom table. The soft clink of the platinum against the wood echoed in the quiet room. She did not say a word to him. She didn't have to. The relationship was dead killed not by Lucas's corporate maneuvering, but by Brandon's own profound cowardice. Two security guards entered through the glass doors, placing their hands firmly on Brandon's shoulders. He didn't fight them. He was a hollowed-out shell as they led him away, his footsteps fading down the carpeted hallway. The compliance officers and the lawyer quietly packed their briefcases and filed out, sensing the suffocating gravity of the room. Within minutes, the sprawling boardroom was empty, save for two people. Ivy stood near the door, stripped of her fiancé, her future, and her pride. At the head of the table, Lucas remained seated, his hands resting on his cane, watching the woman who had broken him stand entirely alone in the ruins she had built. The winter wind off Lake Michigan howled against the reinforced glass of Lucas's penthouse, a stark, violent contrast to the suffocating silence inside. It was past midnight. The city below was a grid of indifferent, glittering lights, entirely oblivious to the empires rising and falling within its steel towers. Lucas stood by the window, a heavy crystal tumbler of bourbon resting in his hand. He took a slow sip. It burned a path down his throat, but it did nothing to touch the absolute coldness settling deep within his chest. He had won. The execution had been flawless. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Brandon Gray was a pariah, stripped of his title, his reputation, and his future. The SEC would dismantle whatever pieces were left of his professional life. And Ivy had walked out of the Parker Consulting building with nothing but the clothes on her back, leaving behind the platinum engagement ring and the fragile illusion of the life she had traded her soul to acquire. This was the exact moment Lucas had visualized during the darkest hours of his recovery. Through the agonizing physical therapy, the blinding nerve pain, and the crushing, humiliating loneliness of an empty suburban house, he had forged himself into a weapon specifically for this day. He shifted his weight, and a sharp, familiar spike of agony shot up his right leg. Lucas closed his eyes, leaning heavily on the silver handle of his cane. He waited for the phantom satisfaction of his revenge to wash over him, to finally anesthetize the physical and psychological pain. He waited to feel whole again. Nothing came. Breaking the man who took his wife did not fix his shattered spine. Exposing Ivy to the cowardly hollow core of her own choices did not erase the memory of the woman who used to fall asleep against his chest. He had meticulously burned their world to the ground, only to realize he was still standing in the ashes of his own. Miles away, on the other side of the city, the same silence swallowed Ivy. She stood in the center of the Gold Coast apartment. The closet doors were wide open. A single medium-sized leather suitcase sat on the unmade bed, half filled with neutral sweaters and simple slacks. The designer gowns, the expensive jewelry, the curated artifacts of a life financed by Brandon Gray, she left them all exactly where they hung. It was a terrifying, perfect echo of a night 3 years ago. But this time she wasn't leaving to run toward a thrilling, stolen romance. She was leaving because there was nowhere else to exist. The apartment wasn't hers. The man whose name was on the lease was currently sitting in a downtown bar, drowning in gin and impending federal charges, actively blaming her to anyone who would listen. Ivy slowly zipped the suitcase. The metallic sound was deafening in the empty room. She caught her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She looked exactly the same as she had the day she walked out of Lucas's hospital room, yet she knew with a sickening, permanent clarity that she was entirely ruined. There would be no grand redemption, no tearful apologies. Lucas didn't want her suffering. He simply didn't want her at all. Ivy picked up the suitcase and walked out the front door, leaving the heavy brass keys on the glass console table. The deadbolt click had shoved behind her, sealing away the last 3 years of her life. Back in his penthouse, Lucas finally turned away from the window. He set his untouched glass of bourbon down on the mahogany desk and limped slowly into the dark, empty bedroom, carrying the permanent heavy weight of a victory that felt exactly like a funeral.